Deciding whether to use GraphQL or REST for your application really depends on various factors and considerations. So first, you want to understand your data requirements. Consider the complexity of your application's data needs. If your application requires fetching data for multiple resources with varying structures, GraphQL's flexible querying might be beneficial. If your data model is relatively simple and fits well with REST predefined endpoints, GraphQL might not provide significant advantages. Evaluate your application's use cases. So you want to identify the use cases where you need to retrieve and manipulate data. If your application involves dynamic user interfaces or requires real-time updates, GraphQL's capabilities can be advantageous. For applications with straightforward CRUD, create, read, update, delete operations, REST might be more sufficient and simpler to implement. Consider network efficiency. Evaluate your network's efficiency requirements for your application. If minimizing the number of requests and optimizing data fetching is critical, GraphQL's batch queries might be a significant advantage. For applications where network efficiency is not a primary concern, REST might suffice. Next, you want to consider API complexity and maintenance. Think of how often your API structure might change. If your API evolves frequently, GraphQL's schema-based approach and introspection capabilities could simplify client-server coordination. If your API structure is relatively stable and follows the REST principles, you might not experience the same degree of complexity that GraphQL addresses. Next, you want to consider your front-end development team. Consider your front-end development team's expertise and familiarity with GraphQL and REST. If your team is experienced with GraphQL or is open to learning it, the benefits of GraphQL might outweigh the learning curve. If your team is well-versed in REST and transitioning to GraphQL could introduce challenges, sticking with REST might be a smoother option. Next, you want to consider existing infrastructure. Evaluate your existing infrastructure and ecosystem. If you have tools, libraries, or services that are designed for REST integration, transitioning to GraphQL might require additional adjustments. If your infrastructure is already set up for GraphQL or can adapt to it easily, the transition might be more straightforward. Next, you want to analyze your application's performance needs. If caking and optimizing data retrieval are essential, GraphQL's ability to fine-tune data requests could be advantageous. If performance is not a primary concern, or if you can achieve adequate performance with REST, this might not be a deciding factor. Last but not least, you want to consider scalability. Consider the scalability requirements of your application. GraphQL's ability to fetch only required data can help optimize server resources, especially as your application grows. REST can also be scalable, but GraphQL's fine-grained control over data retrieval might provide an edge in certain scenarios. Ultimately, the decision between GraphQL and REST depends on your application's specific needs, your development team's expertise, and the trade-offs you're willing to make. In some cases, a hybrid approach where you use both GraphQL and REST for different parts of your application might be a suitable compromise. It's essential to weigh the pros and cons based on the context before making a decision, which is what we're seeing a lot of companies do, especially with the results from our state of software quality.